Hello ladies and gentlemen, Goldar here. Today we are looking at Tortos in Throne of Thunder. And this of course is the fourth boss, and he's just an adorable little turtle, yes he is. Stuck inside this little wedge, he can't seem to move very much. So this fight is fairly easy. There aren't very many mechanics, not a lot to think about. There's just a bit of spike healing to manage. Pretty simple tanking. And then it's kind of a fun little mechanic where you get to kick shells around. So let's go ahead and get into it. So raid makeup for this fight is pretty simple. You'll want 2 healers, perhaps 3, and 2 tanks. You can also do it with 1 tank technically, but you'll need some form of misdirection or a way to manage threat because there are adds that will spawn throughout the fight. There isn't any mechanic that requires 2 tanks, such as tank swap debuffs that you usually get, but your tank cannot leave melee range of the boss during the fight. So if you use a single tank, as I said, make sure you have a way to manage threat on the adds to get them onto that tank, or just have a way to force the adds to the tank by getting them on a healer that's near him or something like that. So you could use like a Paladin with Righteous Fury up, standing near the tank position, perhaps. So while there aren't very many mechanics in this fight, the main gimmick here is the use of turtle shells. So every 60 seconds during the fight, Tortos will spawn 3 whirl turtles, and these appear under his legs, and they come swirling out and move in random directions around the arena. If they touch anyone, they'll do about 90,000 physical to you, and knock you in the air for a moment, so you're stunned basically, just like that. However, the shells only have, or the turtles rather, have about 3 million health, and when you kill a turtle, it will die where it was standing, of course, and leave behind its shell. Now, when you get close to a shell, you'll see a green arrow that will indicate the direction between you and the center of the shell, and this is used to aim the shell, because you have an extra action button, which will allow you to kick the shell, just like I did there. So you kick it in the direction that you're facing. Now this main gimmick is used in one of 2 ways, really. The first is that any enemy it hits, whether it be a whirl turtle, a vampiric cave bat, or Tortos himself, will debuff that target to cause them to take 25% extra damage for 20 seconds. So that's the primary use. And then the other use is to interrupt spellcasts on Tortos. Now, it seems you can only interrupt one of his abilities, even though he has 2 spells that are actually cast time abilities. So the first one of those is Furious Stone Breath, which is coming up right now. So there it's casting. You can see I kick the shell into him, and it interrupts him. So Furious Stone Breath is basically a raid wipe ability. It's a way of forcing you to use the shell mechanic to stop the cast and do it in such a way that it's timed. And it will also, of course, debuff him, as I mentioned, for 20 seconds. If you don't interrupt the cast, it has a 5-second cast, and when it starts channeling, it does about 150,000 physical damage every half second to the entire raid. So it just wipes you in a couple seconds. Therefore, you have to have at least 1 raid member near a killed turtle so that they can kick the shell when that cast is about to start. So you'll notice throughout the video, that's pretty much my role here. So there's Furious Stone Breath again, and I kick the shell into him, and he stops casting. And that's it. Pretty simple. So he does the breath every 45 seconds. And of course, as I mentioned, whirl turtles spawn every 60 seconds, but in sets of 3. So this, of course, means that you basically need about 1 1/4 shells per spawn to save to interrupt the wipe mechanic, the Furious Stone Breath. So basically, as long as you just have 1 shell from every set saved for that ability, you can use the other 2 shells freely to do whatever you like. And again, because you can debuff any of the mobs in the fight, this is most useful to use that debuff to allow your raid to kill other stuff that's going on. So let's talk about the adds. such as the bats. Every 45 seconds, a set of cave bats will spawn at the top of the cave here and quickly fly down and engage your raid. Now these are not very difficult, but as talked about early during the raid composition, you do need a tank to manage these bats. It can either be your main tank on the boss, as long as you can get the bats to that player, or it can be your off tank. So in our case, we're just using a second tank because we weren't worried about the DPS check. So once the bats come down, and they should be picked up by the tank, and they can be tanked pretty much anywhere. Now, if you want to be most useful, you should tank the bats in a straight line between an existing turtle shell and the boss. So that way, when the shell is kicked into the bats, it also hits the boss and debuffs everything in a straight line. So this is not necessary by any means, but it is helpful. That said, you should generally try to use a turtle shell on the clump of cave bats once they're aggroed in one position. As mentioned before, you do not need to save all the shells to interrupt the Furious Stone Breath, so you want to utilize some of them for other purposes. So in this case, you can debuff the bats and cause your DPS to do 25% more damage while you're burning them down. Now that said, the bats have one basic mechanic. They do a normal melee attack, but if they are attacking a target that is below 350,000 health, their attacks will also cause a drain life effect, basically healing them for 10 times the amount of damage that their melee did. So you need to make sure your tank that is on them has a lot of HP. Ideally you want to use stamina trinkets and all that good stuff if they're available, just to give them a little bit more of a barrier between their max health total and that 350,000 where the drain health starts to occur. Now that said, it's not required that they have a lot of health. The other option, of course, is just to use cooldowns so that the damage that they deal to the tank will not really get that player below that threshold very often. The other thing to do is just make sure your healers are keeping the tank topped off. So obviously if you're spamming heals on that player, chances are they're not going to go below that threshold anyway. So you can use one or all of these things. But the idea is to keep the tank pretty high health while the bats are active and while you're DPSing them. If you use a strategy that basically doesn't DPS the bats right away, keeps them on the tank for a while, then obviously it doesn't matter if they heal because they're going to be full health anyway. So you can just let them heal freely for a few seconds until you DPS them and then make sure the tank is full at that point. In our case, we would just DPS them right away because there's always a shell available. And so I would generally try to kick one into the bats and then our DPS would AE them down. And it's pretty simple. So the final ability here is Quake Stomp. And this is probably the key ability in terms of difficulty for this fight, the one that you'll have to practice the most to deal with. But once you get it down, the rest should fall in place really quickly, and you'll get this fight down in no time. So this is really the only mechanic that will probably kill people once you, of course, get the shell timing down to interrupt the breath. But otherwise, Quake Stomp is really the most dangerous ability. So basically, it's a short cast time by Tortos. He did it just a moment ago. And when he stomps the ground, it does moderate physical damage to the entire raid, around 150,000 or so. Most players will be about half health if they were full. And in addition, it causes rockfall to be much more frequent for about 8 seconds after that cast. Now, rockfall you've seen throughout the fight, and these are basically just rocks falling, as you can imagine, from the ceiling at random player locations. So you can see a blue marker there, circle indicating a rockfall there. So if you stand inside the blue circle of rockfall, you take about 350,000 nature damage. So not necessarily a one-shot, but pretty close if you're not full health. So be very careful. If you are within 20 yards of a rockfall, but not in the blue circle, instead you'll take moderate damage, about 60,000 or so. So Most of the time, a rockfall near you will do some damage to you, but it should not be deadly damage if you move a little bit. Now, that said, because Stomp causes upfront physical damage plus frequently rock falls all around the raid for a few seconds, this means that there's a lot of dodging going on when that occurs. So if you see right here, Quake Stomp is started, and if you watch the ground, all these little blue circles are the rock falls coming much more frequently. So the good news is that because rockfall always targets a player's location when it begins, there's no reason that a player should ever have to get hit by the actual, rockfall circle damage. They'll probably be hit by the 20-yard range of so many falls, but the actual primary hit, you can just keep moving into open ground and never be hit by it. Now, one way to deal with this that we tried, and it worked fairly well, is to basically clump the raid up just as the Quake Stomp is occurring, and then spread apart from that location. And that way the rock falls will all start out in a given spot. So right there, we're sort of clumping near blue, except for me because I'm doing shell stuff, in the center. And then as the rock fall begins, everyone spreads out to the sides, right or left. It doesn't really matter. And there doesn't have to be very much rhyme or reason to it. But the goal here is that when the stomps begins and those first couple rock falls start, they're all going to be basically in the same location, not spread around the room randomly. And then as you move away, if you keep moving in one direction, you'll always be out of that 20-yard radius, of the minor damage portion, because you just can move that far before it actually falls. So, yeah, if you're having trouble with that damage, healing that phase, try something like that. Clump everyone up in a given location when it starts, and then have them all move opposite that location as the falls begin, and it should be much easier. Now, as I mentioned, I was not really doing the same pattern everyone else was because of the turtle kicking. So the person that you have assigned to kicking the shell to interrupt the breath needs to be aware that breath always follows Quake Stomp within a few seconds. So as Quake Stomp is occurring, that player should be looking to find the shell that they're going to kick next and getting in position. More than one occasion, as we were practicing, I was not prepared and I was not in position in time, and we get a tick of the breath or even a couple ticks and potentially wipe the raid. So be careful of that, basically. Yeah. Other than that, I think the fight is pretty simple and everything's covered. So that is Tortos, the friendly turtle. Good luck, and thanks for watching.